the boss before his son took over, and probably around 1950-ish when that transfer of power began.
But the father, interesting enough, is whenever you talk about any business, or I hate to say this, even in the mob, generally any second generation anything, whether it be the mob or business, whatever it is, generally doesn't do as well. But candidly, the son totally usurped the power of the father. If you could just kind of give a little bit of color to that.
Oh, yeah. So Santos Sr. took over in around 1940. The previous boss, Ignacio Antinori, was shot and killed outside Ybor City neighborhood on the outskirts of Tampa. And he kind of pushed out the reigning other power was a guy named Charlie Wall. So really, by the time Santos Sr. started gaining power and kind of solidifying his hold in the 40s, he was getting older. He got sick. And like I said, around 1950, Santo Jr. moves into the picture. A couple key things there, I think, kind of set him apart. He solidifies ties with mobsters in New York City. He's invited to Joe Profaci's daughter's wedding, or son's wedding, daughter's wedding, I think. He's at Appalachian. So, all of a sudden he's thrust into a bigger spotlight because of his power base. That's not to say when he took over, there was actually a little bit of a resurgence of violence in Tampa. There was another faction that was kind of jostling for power, but he took the mantle. And the other thing I think was a big part of that was the interest in Cuba. I mean, they were making a lot of money in Cuba with the casinos, and Trafficante Jr. and Sr. to some extent before he passed, but Jr. really was the guy there.
Now, so he hooks up with New York, right? He builds up a local power base, but he also became immensely wealthy. What was the source of his initial wealth?
So illegal gambling was always really probably one of the biggest moneymakers for organized crime in Tampa. Yeah. You had bootlegging. You did have narcotics. The Tampa Mafia were always involved tangentially in the narcotics trade. But really, illegal gambling, a game called Bolita, was big money. Yeah, and not just in Tampa, throughout Florida.
Yeah.
And even in Miami, which, of course, most mob aficionados know was an open city.
Yeah.
Trafficante, he lived there for a while in the 60s, and he had a lot of even though he didn't control it, when guys would come down, they would go see him, and he had elite operations there. So, legal gambling. And definitely, I think Cuba, had Cuba continued, he would have definitely been among the wealthiest.
Interesting. But what fascinates me about Santo Trafficante Jr. is, and you could argue, especially in the 60s, there were some crews in New York that were 35 deep. But I understand the Tampa Mafia was in the 30s, like not a huge number of made men. Did it peak and get down to 30, or was 35 always a working number?
I think around 30, between 35 and maybe 50, but that's as big as it got. And you're right. Now they had a strong affiliate associate base, but it was Trafficante, like Carlos Marcello, their power was not really proportional to the size of their families. I think they had kind of outsized influence compared to the size of their families.
Interesting. All right. So he builds up. He's a wealthy guy. He was also kind of a bit of a trailblazer. So he saw Cuba before Cuba was Cuba, So give us how, obviously you spoke Spanish. He had some advantage geographically, but it's not easy to sit at that table. So was he already powerful and then leveraged Cuba to become more powerful, or was Cuba made him? You get what I'm saying? What was it like?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
So the Tampa mob actually had interests in Cuba dating back to the Prohibition era. And there's a great story that President Machado, when he left Cuba in the late 30s, stayed at the house of Ignacio Antinori in Tampa. So the Tampa mob had kind of started having those relationships. I mean, Cuba was their their source of bootleg liquor and rum and narcotics in the 1920s. Human smuggling also via Havana and through Tampa in the 1920s.
Wow.
But really what kind of kicked things into high gear for Santo Jr. and what able to give him kind of that bigger push was the post-World War II tourism boom. And then you have a friendly government in Cuba now under Fulgencio Batista. You have Meyer Lansky down there. Yeah. And Trafficante growing